The year is 793 AD. A shadow falls upon the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the Northumbrian coast. It is a shadow cast by longships, their prows carved with fearsome beasts. These are no peaceful visitors. These are Vikings, warriors from the north, driven by a hunger for plunder and glory. Their arrival on Lindisfarne marks the beginning of a new era, the Viking Age. The monks of Lindisfarne, known for their peaceful learning, are taken completely unawares. The Vikings descend upon the monastery, a whirlwind of violence and destruction. They pillage its treasures, desecrate its sacred spaces, and leave a trail of carnage in their wake. News of the raid spreads like wildfire, carrying fear and terror throughout England. The raid on Lindisfarne was not an isolated incident. It was a thunderclap, a harbinger of things to come. Across the sea, a new force had awakened, a force that would forever alter the course of English history. The Vikings, with their insatiable appetite for wealth and their unmatched seafaring skills, would become a constant threat, their longships a terrifying sight on the horizon. At the time of the Viking incursions, England was a land divided. 7 kingdoms, collectively known as the Heptarchy, vied for power and dominance: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex and Wessex. Each kingdom, with its own ruler and ambitions, was ill-prepared for the scale and ferocity of the Viking onslaught. These Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, though often at odds with each other, shared a common vulnerability. Their military strength lay primarily in land-based forces, ill-equipped to combat the Vikings' mastery of the seas. Coastal defences were weak, leaving settlements vulnerable to the Vikings' lightning raids. The fractured nature of England, with its competing kingdoms and internal rivalries, played into the Vikings' hands. While the Anglo-Saxons squabbled amongst themselves, the Vikings, united by a common purpose, exploited the land's divisions to their advantage. They would pit one kingdom against another, playing them off each other to maximize their gains. The Viking Age had begun, and England, fragmented and vulnerable, would become the stage upon which a dramatic and bloody saga would unfold. The kingdoms of the Heptarchy, each with its own strengths and weaknesses, were ill-equipped to deal with the unprecedented challenge posed by the Vikings. Their armies, primarily composed of foot soldiers, were no match for the Vikings' mobility and ferocity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a key historical source for this period, paints a grim picture of the Vikings' early raids. The Vikings' skilled navigators and shipbuilders could strike with impunity, appearing seemingly out of nowhere aboard their swift longships. They targeted coastal monasteries and settlements, drawn by the promise of easily obtainable wealth and the relative lack of resistance. The monks of Lindisfarne were but the first victims of this new era of Viking aggression. The Vikings' success stemmed not just from their military prowess, but also from their shrewd understanding of the English landscape and political climate. They established temporary bases along the coast, using these as launching pads for raids further inland. Rivers, the lifeblood of Anglo-Saxon England, became Viking highways, allowing them to penetrate deep into the heart of the kingdoms. Year after year, the Vikings returned, their raids becoming bolder and more destructive. Monasteries, once havens of peace and learning, were plundered and burned. Towns and villages were put to the torch, their inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the Vikings' brutality, describing how they spread terror and devastation wherever they went. The Vikings' early raids were not merely acts of mindless violence, they were calculated campaigns driven by a desire for wealth and, increasingly, land. The Vikings, hailing from the resource-scarce lands of Scandinavia, saw in England a land of plenty, ripe for the taking. Gold, silver and religious artifacts looted from monasteries fetched a high price back in Scandinavia, but the Vikings also sought more lasting rewards. They began to establish settlements along the English coast, using these as bases for further expansion. These settlements, often strategically located at river mouths or on islands, provided safe havens and control over vital trade routes. The Vikings' impact on England went beyond the immediate destruction and plunder. Their raids disrupted trade, threw local economies into chaos, and instilled a deep sense of fear and uncertainty in the population. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle laments the endless winter of suffering that had descended upon the land. The Vikings' success also exposed the weaknesses inherent in the heptarchy. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each focused on its own survival, proved unable to mount a coordinated defense against the common enemy. Their failure to unite would have dire consequences in the years to come, paving the way for a new chapter in the Viking Age, the era of conquest and settlement. Of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria, once a centre of learning and power, was the hardest hit by the initial Viking onslaught. The raid on Lindisfarne had shaken the kingdom to its core, and worse was to come. In 865 AD, a new Viking force, larger and more formidable than any before, landed on English shores. This was not a raiding party, but an army of conquest, intent on carving out a kingdom of their own. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle refers to this force as the Great Heathen Army, and its arrival would mark a turning point in the Viking Age. The Great Heathen Army, led by legendary Viking warlords like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, first set their sights on Northumbria. The kingdom, weakened by internal strife and previous Viking raids, was ill-prepared for the scale of the invasion. The Vikings, ruthless and efficient, swept through Northumbria, capturing its capital, York, in 866 AD. The fall of York marked the beginning of the end for Northumbria as an independent kingdom. The Vikings, having tasted victory, would not be content with mere plunder. They had come to stay, and England would never be the same. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 AD marked a turning point in the Viking Age. This was no mere raiding party seeking quick plunder. This was an invasion force of unprecedented size and ambition, led by some of the most feared Viking warlords of the age. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a vital source for this period, records the Vikings' arrival with a mix of awe and terror. The Chronicle identifies the leaders of this formidable force as the Sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, a legendary Viking chieftain whose exploits were celebrated in Norse sagas. Among the Sons of Ragnar, Ivar the Boneless stands out as a figure of particular cunning and ruthlessness. His epithet, the Boneless, has been the subject of much speculation, with some suggesting it referred to a physical condition, while others interpret it as a testament to his strategic brilliance and ability to seemingly slither past his enemy's defences. Another prominent figure in the Great Heathen Army was Halfdan Ragnarsson, a fierce warrior who would later play a pivotal role in the conquest of Northumbria. The sagas portray Halfdan as a man of action, eager for battle, and driven by a thirst for glory. Together, Ivar, Halfdan and their brothers would unleash a reign of terror upon the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, their names becoming synonymous with Viking might and ambition. Theirs was a campaign driven by a desire for land, power, and, according to some accounts, vengeance for their father's death at the hands of an English king. The Great Heathen Army, with the raven banner of Odin, the Norse god of war and death, fluttering above their longships, first set their sights on Northumbria. The kingdom, already weakened by internal strife and previous Viking raids, was ill-prepared for the scale of the invasion. The Vikings, employing their characteristic blend of ferocity and strategic cunning, quickly overran Northumbria's defences. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes how the Vikings, like wolves upon the fold, swept through the countryside, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. In 866 AD, the Vikings captured York, Northumbria's capital, and a city of significant strategic and symbolic importance. The fall of York sent shockwaves throughout the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, signalling the arrival of a new and dangerous era. The Vikings were no longer content with mere raiding; they had come to stay. The capture of York was not merely a military victory, it was a statement of intent. The Vikings, having established a firm foothold in Northumbria, would use this as a base for further expansion southward, their ambitions extending far beyond the borders of a single kingdom. The fate of England, once a patchwork of squabbling kingdoms, now hung in the balance. Emboldened by their success in Northumbria, the Vikings turned their attention south, their raven banners casting a long shadow over the heart of England. Their next target was Mercia, the largest and, at that time, arguably the most powerful of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Mercian king Burgred, faced with this formidable enemy, opted for a strategy of negotiation and appeasement. He offered the Vikings a substantial sum of silver, hoping to buy them off and persuade them to leave his kingdom in peace. However, the Vikings, their appetite for plunder and conquest insatiable, accepted the payment but continued their advance. The Vikings, masters of both land and river warfare, laid siege to Nottingham, a strategically important town in Mercia. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the siege with stark brevity, noting how the Vikings besieged the town and made great slaughter therein. The fall of Nottingham further demonstrated the Vikings' military might and their determination to carve out a kingdom of their own on English soil. The Mercian king, his kingdom overrun and his forces depleted, was forced to appeal for aid from Wessex, a kingdom in the south that had so far managed to avoid the full brunt of the Viking onslaught. The fate of England now rested on the shoulders of the West Saxons and their young king, a man who would later be remembered as Alfred the Great. In 871 AD, the Viking tide reached the borders of Wessex, a kingdom that would prove to be a far more formidable opponent than Northumbria or Mercia. At the helm of Wessex stood a new king, Alfred, who had ascended to the throne following the death of his brother Ethelred. Alfred, a figure of both historical and legendary stature, would come to embody the spirit of Anglo-Saxon resistance against the Viking invaders. He was a man of great intellect, piety, and military acumen, qualities that would prove essential in the coming struggle for the survival of his kingdom. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, likely compiled under Alfred's patronage, portrays him as a king who, led by example, fighting alongside his men in numerous battles against the Vikings. Alfred understood that defeating the Vikings required more than just military might. It demanded strategic innovation and a willingness to adapt to the enemy's tactics. Under Alfred's leadership, Wessex underwent a period of intense military and societal reform. He established a system of fortified towns known as burhs to serve as defensive strongholds and rallying points for his forces. He also oversaw the construction of a new navy, recognizing the need to challenge the Vikings on their own element, the sea. Alfred's reforms, coupled with his own courage and determination, laid the foundation for a resurgent Wessex, a kingdom that would ultimately stand as a bulwark against the Viking advance and play a pivotal role in the eventual unification of England. The Viking invasions of the 9th century had a profound and lasting impact on the political landscape of England. The once dominant kingdoms of the Heptarchy, weakened by internal strife and unable to mount a unified defense, crumbled under the weight of the Viking onslaught. What emerged from this crucible of conflict was a fragmented and unstable political order. Northumbria, once a centre of learning and power, was the first to fall. The Viking capture of York in 866 AD effectively shattered the kingdom, dividing it into a patchwork of Viking-controlled territories and smaller, semi-independent Anglo-Saxon enclaves. The once proud kingdom of Northumbria, its glory days a fading memory, was reduced to a shadow of its former self. Mercia, the largest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, fared little better. Despite initial attempts at resistance and appeasement, Mercia too succumbed to the Viking advance. The kingdom was partitioned, with the eastern regions falling under direct Viking control, while the western portions remained under the tenuous rule of Anglo-Saxon puppets, their authority dependent on Viking approval. The Viking invasions, with their brutality and disruption, exposed the inherent weaknesses of the Heptarchy. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each focused on its own survival and often at odds with one another, proved incapable of uniting against the common enemy. This lack of unity, a recurring theme in Anglo-Saxon history, had disastrous consequences, allowing the Vikings to exploit divisions and conquer piecemeal what they could never have hoped to conquer as a whole. Amidst the chaos and fragmentation of the Viking Age, one Anglo-Saxon kingdom emerged as a beacon of hope and resistance: Wessex. Under the astute leadership of Alfred the Great, Wessex not only survived the Viking onslaught, but laid the foundation for the eventual unification of England under Anglo-Saxon rule. Alfred's reign from 871 to 899 AD was a turning point in Anglo-Saxon history. He understood that defeating the Vikings required more than just military might. It demanded a fundamental transformation of Anglo-Saxon society and its institutions. Alfred embarked on a series of ambitious reforms, strengthening the military, promoting education and literacy, and fostering a sense of shared identity among his people. Recognizing the importance of fortified strongholds, Alfred oversaw the construction of a network of burhs, strategically located towns and cities fortified to withstand Viking sieges. These burhs served as defensive hubs, protecting the populace and providing bases for Anglo-Saxon counterattacks. Alfred also understood the need to challenge Viking dominance at sea. He commissioned the building of a new fleet of warships, larger and more maneuverable than the traditional Viking longships. This investment in naval power marked a significant shift in Anglo-Saxon military thinking, allowing Alfred to contest Viking control of the waterways and protect Wessex's coastlines from raids. The Treaty of Wedmore, signed in 878 AD between Alfred the Great and the Viking leader Guthrum, formalized a new geopolitical reality in England. The treaty divided the island into two distinct zones, Wessex and the Danelaw. Wessex, under Alfred's rule, encompassed the southwestern portion of England. It represented a bastion of Anglo-Saxon culture and law, a realm where Alfred's reforms aimed to rebuild and strengthen the kingdom after decades of conflict. The Danelaw, as its name suggests, fell under Viking control. It encompassed a vast swathe of eastern and northern England, stretching from Northumbria down to East Anglia and parts of Mercia. The Danelaw, while nominally under the authority of Viking kings, was far from a unified entity. It was a patchwork of smaller Viking kingdoms and earldoms, often ruled by warlords who had arrived with the great heathen army. These Viking rulers, while adhering to Norse customs and law, often adopted aspects of Anglo-Saxon culture, integrating themselves into the existing power structures. The establishment of the Danelaw had a profound and lasting impact on English society. It led to a blending of cultures, with Norse language, customs and law leaving an indelible mark on the regions under Viking control. Place names, legal systems, and even everyday vocabulary still bear witness to this period of intense cultural exchange. The Danelaw, while initially a symbol of Viking dominance, would eventually become a catalyst for the emergence of a more unified and powerful English kingdom. The year 871 AD marked a turning point in the Viking Age and in the history of England. It was a year of both tragedy and transformation, a year that saw the death of one king and the rise of another. Ethelred, King of Wessex, lay dead, mortally wounded in a skirmish against the relentless Viking invaders. His younger brother Alfred, barely out of his teens, inherited a kingdom teetering on the brink. Alfred was not a man born for war. He was known for his piety, his love of learning, and his frail health. Yet destiny had thrust upon him the mantle of leadership in the darkest hour for his people. The Viking warlords, sensing an opportunity, pressed their advantage, their longships a constant menace along the coasts and rivers of Wessex. The early years of Alfred's reign were a baptism by fire. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a vital historical source for this period, records a series of defeats and setbacks for the West Saxons. The Vikings, under the command of warlords like Guthrum and Halfdan, were relentless in their attacks, their raids becoming increasingly daring and destructive. Alfred, however, refused to be cowed. He understood that survival depended on adaptation, on learning from the enemy and exploiting their weaknesses. He observed the Vikings' tactics, their mastery of surprise, and their ability to move swiftly across both land and water. He recognized the need for a more mobile and responsive army, one capable of meeting the Viking threat head-on. Alfred's genius lay not just in his military acumen, but also in his understanding of the broader challenges facing his kingdom. He realized that defeating the Vikings required more than just winning battles. It demanded a fundamental transformation of Wessex's defenses, its economy, and even its very identity. Under Alfred's direction, Wessex underwent a period of intense reform and innovation. He oversaw the construction of a network of fortified towns known as burhs, strategically located throughout the kingdom to serve as defensive strongholds and administrative centres. These burhs, often built on ancient Roman foundations, were linked by a system of roads, allowing for the rapid movement of troops and supplies. Recognizing the importance of sea power in countering the Viking threat, Alfred invested heavily in the construction of a new fleet of warships. These ships, larger and faster than the traditional Viking longships, were designed to challenge Viking dominance in the English Channel and protect Wessex's coasts from raids. Alfred's reforms extended beyond the military sphere. He recognized that a strong kingdom needed a literate and educated populace. He established schools and encouraged the translation of important religious and literary works from Latin into Old English, making knowledge accessible to a wider segment of society. Alfred's reforms, coupled with his own tenacity and the growing resolve of the West Saxon people, began to turn the tide against the Vikings. In 878 AD, Alfred, leading a force of West Saxon warriors, decisively defeated Guthrum's Viking army at the Battle of Edington. This victory, celebrated in both historical chronicles and later legends, marked a turning point in the struggle for England. Guthrum, defeated and facing a resurgent Wessex, agreed to the Treaty of Wedmore. This treaty, a landmark agreement, formally divided England into two zones, Wessex in the south and west, and the Danelaw under Viking control in the north and east. The treaty also stipulated that Guthrum convert to Christianity, a symbolic act that underscored the shifting balance of power. The Treaty of Wedmore did not mark the end of Viking raids or ambitions in England. However, it did establish a fragile peace, allowing both sides to consolidate their gains and rebuild after decades of conflict. For Alfred, the treaty represented a hard-won victory, a testament to his leadership and the resilience of his people. The peace purchased at Wedmore came at a price. Alfred, throughout his reign, had resorted to paying large sums of silver and gold, known as danegeld, to buy off Viking warlords and persuade them to leave Wessex in peace. This danegeld, while effective in the short term, would later become a source of resentment and a financial burden on the English kingdom. Nevertheless, Alfred's legacy as a king who saved his people from annihilation and laid the foundation for a unified England would remain secure. When Alfred the Great died in 899 AD, he left behind a kingdom transformed. Wessex, once on the brink of collapse under the weight of Viking invasions, had emerged as a beacon of resistance and a catalyst for the eventual unification of England. Alfred's successors, inheriting his vision and his determination, would build upon his legacy, gradually pushing back the frontiers of the Danelaw and forging a new sense of English identity. Edward the Elder, Alfred's son and heir, continued his father's policies of military expansion and fortification. He understood that the peace established at Wedmore was precarious, that the Viking warlords within the Danelaw remained a potent threat, their ambitions for land and power far from extinguished. Edward, a shrewd and ambitious ruler, recognized the need to maintain constant pressure on the Vikings, to exploit their divisions and gradually chip away at their control over eastern England. Edward's reign from 899 to 924 AD was marked by a series of campaigns against the Viking strongholds within the Danelaw. He campaigned relentlessly, year after year, constructing new burhs, consolidating his gains, and gradually extending Wessex's authority northwards. He forged alliances with neighbouring rulers, both Anglo-Saxon and Viking, recognizing that a united front was essential to break the back of Viking power. Edward's success stemmed not just from his military prowess, but also from his political acumen. He understood the importance of winning over the populace within the Danelaw, many of whom had lived under Viking rule for generations. He offered them a place within his realm, recognizing their customs and laws while integrating them into a broader Anglo-Saxon polity. The reign of Aethelstan, Edward the Elder's son, marked a turning point in the struggle for England. Aethelstan, a ruler of immense ambition and military talent, would complete the work begun by his father and grandfather, finally shattering the remnants of Viking power and forging a unified English kingdom that stretched from the Channel to the borders of Scotland. Aethelstan, crowned king in 925 AD, inherited a kingdom on the cusp of greatness. Wessex, through the efforts of Alfred and Edward, had become the dominant power in southern England. The Danelaw, while still a patchwork of Viking kingdoms and earldoms, was weakened by internal strife and increasingly threatened by the growing might of Wessex. Aethelstan, however, was not content with mere dominance. He sought to rule all of England. Aethelstan's opportunity came in 927 AD when the Viking king of York, Sihtric Caich, died. Sihtric had ruled York under Aethelstan's overlordship, a precarious balance of power that crumbled with his death. Aethelstan, seizing the moment, marched north with his army, determined to bring York and the rest of Northumbria under his direct control. The Viking warlords of the Danelaw, recognizing the threat posed by Aethelstan's ambitions, formed a formidable coalition against him. They were joined by Constantine II, King of Scotland, who feared the growing power of Wessex and saw an opportunity to expand his own realm southward. The stage was set for a clash of titans, a battle that would determine the fate of Britain. In the late summer of 937 AD, two great armies clashed in a battle that would echo through the ages. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a vital source for this period, records the clash with a mixture of pride and poetic grandeur, describing a battle that raged from dawn till dusk, a struggle for supremacy that would decide the fate of England. On one side stood Aethelstan, king of the Anglo-Saxons, leading a force composed of West Saxon warriors, Mercian levies, and contingents from his newly acquired territories in the Danelaw. On the other side stood a coalition of Viking warlords, Scottish Highlanders and Welsh allies, united in their opposition to Aethelstan's ambitions. The Viking forces were led by Olaf Guthfrithson, King of Dublin, a fierce warrior and a descendant of the legendary Ivar the Boneless. The exact location of the Battle of Brunanburh remains a subject of debate among historians. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, while providing a vivid account of the battle itself, is frustratingly vague on the specifics of location. What is clear, however, is that the battle was a resounding victory for Aethelstan and his Anglo-Saxon forces. The Chronicle describes how the Anglo-Saxons, fighting with great heart and courage, routed the Viking and Scottish armies, driving them from the field in disarray. Olaf Guthfrithson, his dreams of conquest shattered, barely escaped with his life, fleeing back to Ireland with the remnants of his army. Constantine II, King of Scotland, also fled the field, his hopes of expanding his realm southward dashed. The Battle of Brunanburh marked a turning point in British history. It shattered the last vestiges of Viking power in England, paving the way for the emergence of a unified English kingdom under Anglo-Saxon rule. Aethelstan, his victory complete, could now rightfully claim the title of King of the English, a title that would be passed down through the centuries, a testament to his legacy as the unifier of England. The Viking Age, a period of unprecedented upheaval and transformation in English history, gradually drew to a close in the 10th century. The Battle of Brunanburh, a resounding victory for the Anglo-Saxon king Aethelstan, marked a decisive turning point, shattering the last vestiges of organized Viking resistance and paving the way for the emergence of a unified English kingdom. Yet, the Vikings, though vanquished on the battlefield, left an indelible mark on the land they had sought to conquer. The Danelaw, that vast swath of eastern and northern England that had fallen under Viking control in the 9th century, was gradually reintegrated into the Anglo-Saxon realm. But the process of integration was not one of simple assimilation. The Vikings, through their centuries-long presence, had left an enduring legacy, one that would shape the language, laws, customs, and even the very character of the English people. The Norse language spoken by the Viking settlers gradually merged with the Anglo-Saxon tongue, giving rise to many of the words and grammatical structures that characterize modern English. Place names ending in by, thorp and kirk dot the landscape of England, a testament to the Viking presence. Legal concepts such as the husting, an assembly for legal and political matters, and the wapentake, a territorial division for administrative and military purposes, have their roots in Viking law and custom. The Vikings, though often portrayed as ruthless raiders and plunderers, were also skilled craftsmen, traders, and explorers. They established trading settlements along the coasts and rivers of England, connecting the island to a wider network of commerce that spanned the North Sea and beyond. Their longships, marvels of maritime technology, allowed them to navigate not only the turbulent waters of the North Sea, but also the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, reaching as far west as Iceland, Greenland, and even the shores of North America. The unification of England under Anglo-Saxon rule, a process that reached its culmination in the 10th century, marked the beginning of a new chapter in the island's history. The fragmented and often warring kingdoms of the Heptarchy, weakened by internal strife and Viking incursions, gave way to a more centralized and powerful monarchy, one capable of projecting its authority both within and beyond the borders of England. The legacy of the Viking Age, however, continued to shape the destiny of the new English kingdom. The threat of Viking raids, though significantly diminished, did not entirely disappear. Danish kings, seeking to revive the glories of their Viking forebears, would launch renewed invasions of England in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, culminating in the establishment of a short-lived Danish dynasty under Canute the Great from 1016 to 1035. The English kings, having learned from the successes and failures of their predecessors, adopted many of the military and administrative innovations pioneered during the Viking Age. They maintained standing armies, strengthened the network of buurs, and continued to invest in naval power, recognizing the importance of controlling the seas surrounding their island kingdom. The Viking Age, though often associated with violence, destruction, and upheaval, also left a legacy of cultural exchange, economic dynamism, and political transformation. It was a period that tested the resilience of the Anglo-Saxon people, forcing them to adapt, innovate, and ultimately forge a new sense of shared identity. The England that emerged from the crucible of the Viking Age was a more unified, more powerful, and more outward-looking kingdom, one that would play an increasingly prominent role on the stage of European history.